to the Age of Agility. My name is Nick LaFleur, and I am your host. In this episode, we're joined by a champion of digital adoption. He's here to talk to us about where most organizations go wrong with their digital transformation strategy, and he's going to share some insights from his new book, The DAP Strategy, a new way of working to de-risk and accelerate your digital transformation. Please welcome to the show, Raj Sundarason. Hi, Raj. How are you doing today?
Thank you, and very good. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you, yeah. So, Raj, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in digital programs, kind of at the enterprise level. Like, tell us a bit who you are and what you do with yourself.
I appreciate it. So, today my role is as chief evangelist of WalkMe, which are the pioneers in digital adoption. But I think the journey I've made to getting here is probably a bit more apt. So prior to joining WalkMe, I did a 26,000 employee transformation program. And I did that because I really wanted to understand what was important for customers as they were embarking on these programs and how and why, they seemed to struggle. And this question was in my mind for the longest time because I had spent most of my career on the other side of the fence in HR tech. And so, I've been through digital adoption, I've been through digital transformation. When I was at SAP, I was in cloud transformation, right? But, I cut my teeth in process transformation where, I was at ADP, where I did a lot of payroll outsourcing. So, my journey has been, starting at the process, going to the cloud, getting to the digital piece, and then now understanding, hey, what was missing around that? And my view over the work that I've done over the last 5 years with customers and prospects is there's a glue layer, which I like to call, or what the market is calling, digital adoption.
And what makes it the glue layer?
I think that it's made, I like to call it the glue layer because most organizations, right, have been fixated and focused on the what and the why. What am I buying? Why am I buying? And no one's really figured out, how am I going to make the what and the why work? And so I look at it either, you can call it glue, you can call it the fuel. So it's like, getting into a car, brand new car, or, being part of an F1 team, having the best possible car, the best possible pit crew, right? So best product, best team. But if you don't have any petrol in the engine, you're not going to get out of first gear. And I look at digital adoption as that fuel that can drive us. Now, what really drew me to working with organizations, and their digital transformation programs, in one very simple word, was curiosity. Right? You need to have a curious mind if you want to understand, try to fix, and then look at data and go again. And I think when the problem statement is so vast, think about it for a moment, right? Some of the research I've done, trillions of dollars are being invested in transformation programs. Millions of hours are being lost in productivity purely because people don't know how to use the technology. That's one of the problem statements. The next was, disruption in every major industry you can think of, and disruption in every major organization you can think of is forcing them to change. And then, I was thinking about, how can we really impact users of tech and their lives? And when you put that all together, it seems like a pretty compelling calling to, getting involved in this line of work.
Yeah, I can imagine. It does make sense. There's so much money being spent on purchasing digital solutions and kind of implementing them into the, core systems at a company. But, unless you can get the employees to use it and use it as intended, I can see how there's a lot of lost revenue there. I think this is really great, a way of kind of introducing kind of the book you're writing here, which is the DAP Strategy. It just came out on October 27th. tell us a little bit about that. Like, so how does this strategy kind of help people kind of bridge that gap and get their people using technology in the way they want?
Thank you for that. The book's been a bit of a labor of love. And it brings together 5-10 years of learnings that I've had, and it's really about how organizations need to rethink their digital transformation programs, and it outlines some strategies designed to create different outcomes, and in the process simplify work. So that's the crux of the book. Now, when we start unpacking, what is a digital adoption strategy, I think it's really about, thinking about a different paradigm shift, right? It's really about how you unlock and enable new ways of working that underpin the transformation. And I think that's a subtle piece that's lost in a lot of the programs. And in the process of doing that, you de-risk and accelerate value realization. I'm quite confrontational in the book, so if you like a bit of controversy, you'll enjoy it. I'll give you a couple of examples. I introduced this concept of the power of how, right? And most people say, look, hang on, I'm not, maybe I'm not so comfortable around it. I said, look, the how is the missing ingredient, right? How do we get people to do? How do we get customers to do? How do we? And if you don't laser focus, zero in on that power of how, you're missing a beat. I put a real spotlight, I'm sure we'll get into it a little later, on what the definition of a digital transformation means. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to challenge the reader to think about how to think about value frameworks, right? To communicate the strategy, but also think about how to baseline where you are today, where you'd like to get to, and most importantly, how to quantify that value realized, because that was missing in a lot of the programs that I was involved with.
So what can organizations do right now to kind of start, if they're already mid-transformation, if they're kind of doing this without the digital adoption element, what can they do right away to kind of like change gears and reevaluate their program?
Yeah, so I think, I like to start with definitions, because that really helps to guide where we need to go. And as I was, going through my day job and also writing the book, I asked a very simple question, and maybe, you'll have some time to think about this and I'll get your perspective. But, I asked people, what does to adopt actually mean to you in the context of the program? And it's actually quite a confronting question, because even myself, I had to think for a moment, and as I thought through it, right, it took a while, and so what I did was I went to the dictionary, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary basically says to adopt is to elect or to choose to use something, right? And when I reflected on that, right, what was important was I felt the definition missed something, and what I thought it missed were these 4 words, and the 4 words are really critical, right? In a consistent manner. So to adopt, in my mind, is to elect or to choose to use something in a consistent manner, right? And I think that was the first aha moment for a lot of organizations. Now, the term platform should conjure up, building blocks of functionalities that increase the probability of that piece of tech being used in a consistent manner, right? So when you put it together, that's kind of, the definition. Now, why should everybody start using it? I think the short answer is because whether you know it or not, everyone is demanding it, right? So, I don't think you woke up one day thinking you needed Waze or Google Maps, right? But I think today, if you're going to go somewhere, you're going to punch that in straight off the bat. I mean, that's demand. So for me, digital transformations are not and have not delivered on the promised value. When I look at the data from Battery Ventures, which publishes a paper each year, they're very clear that trillions of dollars are spent on tech, and productivity is kind of flattened out. I also think that work has become more complex, and the forgetting curve is becoming more prevalent. And it's a real thing, is the forgetting curve. And finally, I think companies need more insights to understand how to mitigate the reasons, given the hybrid reality that we live in and the impact of the Great Resignation. So, why should people start thinking and using ADAPT? I said, well, number one, I think it's there and, people are demanding it. I think two, we need to find a way to simplify work. And three, we need to figure out how we can augment strategies to accommodate the new reality of the hybrid workplace.
Yeah, so let's talk about the hybrid workplace. So, I mean, the pandemic and every remote work and kind of growing at such an exponential rate now, what kind of impact has this had on organizations trying to execute on their digital strategy? If you go back, and everything that I talk about when it comes to the DAP strategy, it starts with the user. And when you start thinking about the user, the reality has changed. I like to use an example. You've probably seen the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you have the three lifelines. And traditionally, if you were in the office, right, you'd be messing around, and if you didn't know something, you'd try your luck, and if it didn't go anywhere, what would you do? You'd pick up the phone and phone a friend, right? And typically that friend was in the building, and worst case scenario, they'd come down and off you go. If you couldn't phone a friend and the friend wasn't around, then what do? You turn to your neighbor and say, hey, I'll poll the audience and see what we can do there. I think the hybrid workplace has shifted all of that, because that traditional type of support, right, isn't there. You can't just turn across to your left or your right and get assistance. And so I think organizations need to rethink that type of experience, because that type of experience helps the user with confidence, build the confidence, build the trust, build the ability to execute and progress through the day. And I think what organizations need to do when they build out their strategies is to build out strategies where you're thinking about the most, I suppose, extreme permutation. And if you can solve for that, as you bring it into something which is considered, probably more normal, it becomes far easier. And so I think the demand for this is going to go up, especially with if you overlay the Great Resignation, right? And I know we're all using this term right now, but if you overlay this notion of growth or attrition, right, and you're going to bring in new people into the organizations, right, you're going to have new users who are going to need a different type of support mechanism. It's going to be a far higher touch. So you've got to rethink what that higher touch model looks like. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I myself started my role at QuickBase during the pandemic, and so it was I felt like the learning curve was a lot, slower than it would be traditionally, because you're right, those kind of in-person lifelines weren't there or as readily available, right? It's an interesting concept, because what you're kind of recommending here, it seems, is to kind of take leaders back, to have them take a step back and say, think about how your employees, how your company, how your organization is going to respond to this platform that's here, and like how are you going to kind of bridge that knowledge gap for them. But it's more than just training, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you've touched on there is very interesting. We're now talking about the employee. Let's flip it around for a moment. If you were a producer of a product, would you give them a negative experience? Probably not, right? You would invest as much as you can to get that experience to be the best experience, because you weren't going to blame someone not using the product based on, the UI was bad or whatever it is. So why not give the same type of experience to the employee? Right? I think that's the first part of the piece. What was the follow-on question
So
again, Nick?
I guess really, like, how does a digital adoption program kind of differ? I know that training must be an element of it, but how do you
Yes.
differentiate that for organizations that like have a tough time kind of seeing the difference?
So I think, again, one of the controversial things I say is, we've got to rethink how we do change and adoption and training, because we have to stop using a 20th century mindset to fix a 21st century problem. And I think the first part is to understand what is the problem. The first part of the problem is, and it's twofold. Your digital transformation program is going to entail the user having to learn a whole bunch of new things, regardless of whether you're moving from literally a tech refresh or you're really transforming everything. Okay. Now, the big challenge there, right, is that the human condition suffers from something called the forgetting curve. So we've got something called the learning curve, your propensity to learn, and then the forgetting curve. And in some of the research that I've done, Art Cohen wrote a paper around the forgetting curve and what it entails. And his research basically says that within an hour, you're most likely to forget 50% of the data points that you've just heard, and within a day, 90%. So when you think about, I'm going to roll out more change, more new processes and all that type of stuff, and you've got the forgetting curve, there's your first alarm bell. The second alarm bell really is around the user and their current disposition. So if you think about it, we have this thing called the overwhelmed employee, because we're inundated with email, we're checking our phones 150 times a day, right? We've got different pressures pulling us left, right, and center. Our personal and professional lives are completely blurred, right? And so now that's adding to where we are. So I think that's a layer. The second part is, we can't go and change the user, but what we can do is change how the user can interact with things to get the outcome. And so you'll hear a lot of terminology around learning in the flow of work. I would like to challenge people that maybe we don't need to learn in the flow of work. Maybe it should be executing in the flow of work, because work is about outcomes, not outputs. So for me, I think it's first understanding what the problem is. The second thing is to really think about, can we rethink that paradigm a little bit? So we're solving it because we can't solve at source, if that makes sense. We can't solve it at source because we can't change all the users. But what we can do, right, we can surround the users with the ability to actually solve the problem. And that's executing in the flow of work. And that is what a digital adoption platform lends itself to doing. It's like the GPS, right? If you turn around and you didn't know where you were going, you'd be driving around in circles. The GPS doesn't teach you how to drive. It just shows you how to get to the end point. That's basically the analogy. Does that make
Absolutely.
sense?
So the technology in and of itself would be assisting, right, in the kind of execution.
Yeah.
Oh. And so what kind of results have you seen from organizations that implement this kind of strategy?
So, I'll give you an example. There's a bank that I do a lot of work for, and they came to me and they said, employee experience is really important to us, so we need to be able to measure it. We have a mid-year review process that we go through, and we're trying to lift completion rates. So first question, I said, where are you today? Right? We're at 13% completion rates. Right? So where would you like to get to? She says, not quite sure, but if we could get to the high 50s, that would be great. All right. How much more infrastructure cost do you think that you'd need to bear to raise those levels? Well, we'd have to hire more trainers, we'd have to hire more support agents, because if we wanted more people to do it and they didn't know how to do it, we'd have to have all that infrastructure around. I said, okay. Or we don't have a lot of money, so how do we figure that out? I said, great. And then that's about it. And I said, well, hang on a second. Do you want people just to complete the process? Or do you want people to complete the process accurately? No, you're right. Because I think that's the other thing we've got to figure out. Remember that going back to the definition, in a consistent manner. Yes, we want to do that, right? And I said, okay, great. And then I said, oh, by the way, do you want to know whether the impact is what do you mean? He says, do you want to know whether people are doing it faster? She says, hey, that's a really good idea. So now we've gone from, I just wanted people to complete it. I didn't want to have to invest in too much infrastructure to, I want to measure whether people like the experience. I want to get more people to do it. I don't want to spend as much money on it. I want to make sure it's done accurately, and I want to make sure that it's done in a timely manner. Okay? So what are the results? Okay, the results were this. They went from 13%, not to 50%, to 93% completion rate.
Wow.
Think about that for a moment. Okay? On top of that, they did not need to put on any more support resources, because what we did was we overlaid all the support material, quick reference guides, and key data points in the flow of that work piece, right? And what we were able to measure was 63% of individuals were actually leveraging that content at that specific point for that specific part of the process. And by doing that, you already know you're deflecting the support calls that you needed, right? And underneath that, when we went to measure, we found that the cohort that used the digital adoption platform was completing the process a whole 40 minutes faster than those who didn't. So think about this. I've gone completion rate from 13 to 90%. I haven't needed additional support resources because I've baked that all into the employee user experience, and I can measure who's using what. And on top of that, I can tell you that people now have finished it a whole 40 minutes faster, and then you can actually go on to have a proper conversation. I think that's pretty powerful.
I'd agree, and I'm sure the accuracy of those were much higher as well. And it's amazing because, by doing this, you sort of empower folks who might not be as familiar with the process to provide more accurate results for the people who are more affected by that process and do live it every day. That's amazing.
There's one other thing. You also are dealing with individuals who I call the reactive user, who don't necessarily want to do the process. And so what you're doing is you're making it less, less arduous on them, and in the process, right? The psyche of that individual changes quite dramatically because they don't look at it as a chore anymore. They're like, hey, I can get this done. I can do it quickly. I'm not worried about anything. Let me get on with it, right? And I think there's a multi-dimensional aspect to it. Yeah.
Well, and I think everywhere in business, there's certain places, certain processes where you're just like, wow, this is just really bogged down and sort of red tape, or it just seems like a chore to do. And often those are the kinds of things that's like logging information or, spinning up a report for a table for a report, and things that aren't really the primary focus of that person's role, right? Like they're spending all of this time on kind of process when they could be, focusing on their main function.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that time gain is really impressive. So having kind of a clear goal and outcome and figuring out a plan for adoption is one thing, but what else do organizations need to ensure a successful digital transformation?
I think that there's so many things, but I'd like to zero in on three things. And I think the first one is there is a lot of confusion around what is meant by the term digital transformation.
Okay.
Right? And I like to use the metaphor of a caterpillar and a butterfly, right? And so, are you really transforming? And when we talk about that, you need to understand that transformation is a pretty brutal, painful process. So are you literally going from a caterpillar that's this pesky, worm, destroying crops and chewing on leaves? And are you just thinking of, getting bigger eyes and becoming a fatter worm? Or are you really trying to get through this metamorphosis where you're literally shape-shifting completely and then, becoming this butterfly that can elegantly, soar through the air. And instead of, chewing off leaves, it's actually feeding off nectar and helping cross-pollinate plants. And that process is actually quite painful, right? Because if you've ever seen the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, they're literally digesting themselves and then reforming cells, and what happens is something completely different. I think that's the first piece. And if you identify that, then you identify there is pain. And once you've identified there's pain, then you'll realize that you need to celebrate small wins. And in this case, cell formation into antenna, into body, into wings, those are small wins. And those small wins come together, aid that transformation. Now, I'll give you an example, right? The ATM, the humble ATM, right? If you go back and you rethink the experience it used to be, we used to go in, line up, take probably tens of minutes to line up in a queue, get a sheet of paper, write down how much cash we wanted to take out, hand the slip over, right, to the teller, hand over some ID, whether it's thumbprint or signature, ask Marge how the kids were, right, because you see her every 2 weeks, get the money and go, and that's probably a 30-minute experience, right? Now, if you really want to transform that experience, right, you think about the user at the center and that end-to-end piece. As you're walking out, let's say John taps you on the shoulder. Hey, Nick, we've got this thing called an ATM here, right? Great. He says, what does it do? It says it dispenses cash and does it fast. And you're like, cool, I'm really excited. Yeah, by the way, you got to spend 3 weeks learning. So can I sign you up for a 3-week learning course on how to use an ATM? Now, if someone said that to you, you'll say, hey, maybe next time, the car's parked and I don't have enough change in the meter, maybe next time. But if Nick said, if he said to you, hey, all you have to do is slide in your card, punch in a 4-digit PIN, you get 9 options, click one of them, click how much cash you want, figure out whether you want a receipt with that, right? And it dispenses it in 2 minutes. Guess what? That's transformation.
Right.
That's transformation, right? So I think first of all, understand what that looks like. And the painful part is, because what you've just done there, you've taken away the human element that used to be so important in that banking world because it was all about relationships, right? So, and those are the things you need to manage. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think companies are brave enough, and this is another controversial thing I say, to communicate the business case for change. And they don't do it widely and clearly. So you never know what are the operational and financial metrics, right, that they're trying to impact with the transformation. Because, guess what? If you don't know, right, how do you get everybody aligned to it, right? How do you, what are the implications, right? What are the implications? If we don't do this, this is what's going to happen. And I think that's really, really important to do this, right? And as you're doing it, I think it's really important to get some baseline data, and people don't have that. I'll give you an example of that, right? So I work with another company. They're an engineering services company. And when we were in our discussions, they thought, what you're trying to do is to help us make application usage easier. And I said, no, that's not what we do. And he said, what is it you do? I said, well, the digital adoption strategy is meant to help you execute on those strategic goals. And they're like, okay. And I said, so, can you share with me a couple of them? He said, oh, we'll just pick one. One of our main strategic corporate objectives, Raj, is to improve operating cash flow. I said, wonderful. Do you have metrics for it? Yes. Great. Now, do you understand what the friction is? Yes. Okay, so walk me through it. So he said, look, our real challenge is that, our contracts with customers are net 30-day payment terms. So when they get an invoice, they've got 30 days to pay us. I said, great. Well, not really. I said, why? He says, well, because it actually takes us an additional 30 minutes to get a proper invoice out. So it's actually net 60 days before we get paid. Now, that is what we call day sales outstanding. That has a direct impact to operating cash flow. Operating cash flow has a direct impact to share price. You understand how strategic this is? I said, yeah. So he said, so I said, I like to do something called follow the crumbs of the cookie. He said, so help me walk through the process. And the reality is, when their employees finish a job, someone has to cajole them to go and fill in their timesheet for that particular job. Then someone's got to fill in the right rates and the right codes. And typically that gets all messed up. Then once you've done that, right, it has to go to the customer for validation. They're going to be iterations, comes back, everything gets done, that's the 30 days. Now, when you think about using a digital adoption platform and you can proactively go out and engage with that employee, say, hey, you got to fill out your timesheet, hurry up, right? So now you're like a nagging mum, right? You get that done. When they go in, you've got this assistance all the way through, say, hey, what about this? What about it? So you have the guidance, the engagement, the data validation, the automation. You're getting it done right first time. So you're saving time there. So when it goes to your manager, he's saving time. And when it goes back to the customer, right, now that's the only interdependency. Now, if you can shrink that from 30 days to 15 days, guess what? You're impacting operating cash flow. And so when you communicate that widely, people understand and they understand the implications. You now get everybody aligned on the same journey. That's the second part. And the final third one, and I'll just get through this very quickly, is I think the powers that be need to get into the trenches to experience the pain. So that once they understand and they experience the pain in the boardroom, in the C-suite, right, they can then understand the implications of the pain, and they can get far more intimate with the solution to the pain, which is then driving the friction around the strategic corporate objectives and the financial and operating metrics.
That makes sense. So why, understandably, kind of getting the executive suite and the C-suite to kind of understand the day-to-day pain points, I can see really being able to kind of drive these kind of programs. But why do you think that there is such a history of secrecy or kind of this black box kind of mentality when it comes to digital transformation?
Look, I'm not sure on the secrecy. I think, when people are getting measured on stuff, right, there's a real high degree of accountability. But I think when you're spending tens, hundreds of millions of dollars on programs, we owe it to all our stakeholders, not necessarily shareholders, but employees as well, because, they're staking their careers and, where they elect to spend their time. And that's with you, and I think we need to have that degree of transparency. I think as well, we haven't spent time trying to understand how to solve the problem. So, for example, in a lot of digital transformation programs, I talk to them, or even adoption programs, I said you need to have an understanding of logical pit stops in that program, in that journey. And, I've identified, or rather in the work I've done, identified 5 logical pit stops. So, the first one is, being able to have visibility across your tech stack to understand, hey, are people using? Right? Let's start with that. Right? And if they are using, how many people are using, how often are they using, and how long for? Because then you get a sense of how much value they're getting out of the application. Now, if you can then do that over a 30, 60, 90-day period, you can then find out, hey, am I really getting usage out of the thing? And if I bought 1,000 subscriptions and I only have 100 being used over the last 90 days, then immediately you can ask yourself the question. So, hey, maybe I've bought too many. And if I bought too many, now let's go have a conversation with the vendor, and maybe I can change my contractual relationship, and immediately you've got cashable benefit there, right? Immediate cashable benefit. Now, if you think, well, hey, hang on a second, that wasn't wrong. It's, we've got to figure out how we do this better. You now can dive in from an analytics perspective to actually see and understand geographically and also process-wise, what the challenge is. And so that's the first thing. So, start using the data to understand and diagnose the problem. The second part is, most people didn't rethink system onboarding, and now we're being forced to. System onboarding used to be, hey, we're all going to turn up in a classroom, open up the computer, someone teaches, you pretend to understand what you're doing and click on some buttons, you walk out the door, and what happens? The forgetting curve hits you. Right? And now with the cloud, everybody says there's no reason for me to learn because in 6 months' time, everything's going to change anyway. So, rethinking that. has become very, very important, and being able to track that. And that, digital adoption platform allows you to do that. Third pit stop is which I think is the biggest opportunity, is really around just-in-time help. And what I mean by that is you really have to think about demographic information and support mechanisms. So, I'm a bit older than a lot of people, so I will get up early and use the tech to do whatever I need to so that I can get back to my day job, which is people, right? But, the millennials may say, well, no, I'm going to use the tech at 10:30 at night. Now, what happens if you need help, right? You may not have the support systems, right, that available to you 24/7, number one. More importantly, you wouldn't have the support mechanisms to help you with that specific problem at that specific time, right? Because you demand it now, because we live in a on-demand world, right? And so if you don't have that, you've got a real challenge on your hands. The fourth pit stop is how you handle functional releases. And in the book, I talk about someone moved my button. I was doing some reviews. I went in. The button used to be at the bottom right-hand screen. Guess what? It wasn't there. I went nuts because my brain was conditioned. It's supposed to be there. So what did I do? I played that game, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Picked up the phone, called my HR business partner who was out at lunch, and he said, Raj, we had a WebEx on this. We sent out the video. We sent out the PowerPoint. You didn't turn up. You didn't read it. I don't exactly know where you are, but when I get back, we'll see what happens. I lost 30 minutes. I went out, asked my colleagues. They all looked at me and said, what the heck are you talking about? Right? Now, what happens is if something changes, now, if you come onto a new page and all of a sudden, there's an announcement, hey, something's changed on how to create the form, right? If you want to know how that's changed, click here, show me, boom, and it shows you. Guess what? All those hours of thinking about all of that, out the door, it's done. And then the final one is what I call process optimization, which is a little bit misleading, but users are now saying they want to have a different experience. I don't want to necessarily have to go into the underlying application because I don't really care, but I want to be able to execute on the transaction. So for example, I could be on a Google page and I want to take some vacation. I should be able to click a button, have a conversation with a bot, say, hey, I'd like to take some absence. And the bot should say, okay, start date, end date, reason, execute, and it now take you in, do all of that, automate that, fill in all the fields, and you're done, right? And that's exactly what a digital adoption platform does. And I think when you understand those 5 pit stops and you kind of start solving for those pit stops, you slowly gravitate closer to the potential value realization of those transformations. So I think the first part in where people kind of go awry a little bit is they don't think about them in pit stops. They think about, hey, the transformation is successful at go live, right? I think that's one. The second one is organizations need to acknowledge that we have baby users in the organization. I said, baby users? What the heck is a baby user? So I believe that, we may not be babies. We all might be older, younger, whatever it may be. But when you introduce something new, right, and it's new to us, we're a baby user. We don't have the familiarity. We don't have the mastery. And so what typically happens is, we're trying to sit up, we're trying to crawl, but the organization is demanding that we run. So how do we help the baby user to get from crawling to walking to running? And when they can run, that's when the magic happens, right? So I think those two things, very, very important. And I think the final one is organizations are not holding themselves accountable to value frameworks. And what I mean by that is you need to define the business challenge you're trying to solve. It needs to be quantifiable. It needs to be time-bound. It needs to be personal, because if it isn't, there are no implications. And then you need to map those to key performance indicators like you're trying to impact, just like the bank did, right? Where they were trying to improve completion rates. They were trying to make sure that they didn't have to blow out, infrastructure costs. They were trying to measure, it being completed properly and the process being completed faster. So you do that, and then you reiterate and iterate and iterate. And I think that's kind of something that we need to think about.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. You're right. You get dropped in, and you're new to the process, you're new to the technology, and business wants you to run. And, it's funny that you mentioned sort of the folks who kind of, prefer to operate off hours, or there isn't maybe a support 24/7 support network for them. It's almost like when you log into online banking or something like that, where the website sort of tries to point out where things are for you, give you some kind of wayfinding, and it shouldn't be such a novel concept that companies want to take care of their employees as much as they do their customers. But I think it's something that's it's worth saying.
Penny is dropping.
Right? So I could talk about this all day with you, Raj, but I think, this is a really interesting conversation, and it's interesting how this sort of kind of like skilling up the employees and kind of getting them to be able to, to kind of solve the business problems through adoption is such an interesting idea. We often talk at QuickBase about connecting systems and giving people a central place to view stuff. But I could even see how with a platform like that, it would benefit from a digital adoption strategy, because there's so many custom workflows and processes in there that are built by people. So you kind of drop someone in a new process or workflow, they're going to have to learn how to do it first.
And then worse still, if you change it on them, and they're running, now you've put an obstacle in front of them. And when you put an obstacle in front of them, does that take them back from running to walking? And now the question is, how do you create an environment where you're teaching them how to hurdle it so they're never going back to walking? They're always running. And the more that they're running, the more you're impacting the operational and financial metrics that you're trying to measure, which gives you a better chance of success.
Absolutely. And continuous improvement's always going to happen. So it has to kind of happen.
Absolutely.
This has to happen along with it, right? So it's such a
Amen.
Yeah, I love this. This is so cool. So I think we're ready for kind of our last or not last question, but the question we ask everybody who comes on the show. How do you define agility?
There we go. I think when you think about agility, or where I think about agility, conjures up images of fluidity, elasticity, ultimately flexibility, right? And for me to get there, you need to reduce friction, because friction is the kryptonite to all of this. So when you think about how we handle change today, that is, if we don't do that, we're effectively anti-agility. So friction in the context of work, for me, refers to the obstacles that we put in place around how we get work done. So we need to think about it in a different way, not so much on how we remove obstacles in front of the user, because that's going to come time and time again with functional releases. We can't change that. But what we can probably change is the solution, and is how to help the user hurdle the obstacle. And a digital adoption platform does that. So you don't go from running to crawling, and you maintain that agility within the organization. That's my perspective. For what it's worth.
I love that, because you're right. I think people get thrown off by small changes, or even big changes, without knowing what's coming down the line. And so being able.
Heck, I got thrown off by a button moving,
I understand. Man. No, I mean, I've been there myself. I'm trying to think of one, but I've been there myself, and it is one of those things that could be so infuriating in the moment, and it gets in the way of kind of getting anything else done.
It's quite embarrassing when you're selling the tech yourself and the buttons move and you don't know how to use it. That's really embarrassing, right?
I bet. And then our last question for you, Raj, is just how are you? It's been a long couple of years with all of the pandemic and lockdowns and people staying at home. I don't know what it's like where you are right now, but how are you doing? Personally, professionally?
It's been an interesting 2 years. I mean, my life used to be, I was on the road Sunday to Thursday, three weeks in a month, because I spent a lot of time in my capacity working with customers. And guess what? COVID shut all that down. And for the first time in my entire career, I was in one place. I think my wife was trying to figure out, did she sign up for this? But it changed a lot of relationships. It changed a lot of things that I needed to think about and how I immersed myself. And that's where the book came about, because it was one thing that I wanted to challenge myself, and it gave me a degree of sanity. So, we're hoping normality comes back soon. I mean, we live in Singapore. We've got a very, very high vaccination rate. Hopefully we're going to open up, and life is going to go back to whatever new normal looks like. But I'm pretty good that way. Thank you for asking.
Oh, definitely. This show sort of came about in the middle of the pandemic because it was just a way to check in with our colleagues and people we worked with. And I didn't think that 24 months later or 20 months later we'd still be kind of having this conversation, but remotely all the time. But it has opened up some really cool opportunities, and I think that, if anything, it's always good to check in with each other.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's also given me some time to read, right?
Yeah.
So, I have my favorite author is a guy called Michael Lewis. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And he wrote a book called The Premonition, and it's a pandemic story. And it's very, very interesting, right? I mean, in terms of, if there's a pandemic, what's the first thing you do? And I didn't realize in North America, one of the first things you do is shut down the schools. And so why? He says, well, kids just don't understand the notion of personal space. They're all over each other, right? And that's the quickest way to spread something. And then they said, the other thing is the way, and this was really, really odd, but he said, the school bus is the biggest challenge for all of this. And I said, well, how is the school bus the biggest challenge? He says, well, the benches in the bus are calibrated to be able to accommodate 3 kids on a bench. And what that effectively does with X amount of space. So you're effectively, right, accelerating whatever's going through. So, that might sound really geeky, but it's been quite an interesting time to actually be able to read up and get different perspectives and understand the science around some of the stuff.
Yeah, that's got to be one way to sort of soothe some nerves during the pandemic, is to learn a little bit more about the science, right? Well, I'm really glad to have you join us on the show, Raj. It's been really great. So for everyone listening, please check out Raj's book. Again, it's called The DAP Strategy, a new way of working to de-risk and accelerate your digital transformation. And if you're listening to this, it is available now wherever you can find books. So thanks for joining us on The Age of Agility. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts or on quickbase.com/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you very much, and have a good one.